The first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Liam Byrne MP, who, as well as being the MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill and Solihull North, is also the chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee, which is a cross-party group of MPs that shadow the Department for Business and Trade and look at the issues involved, which of course includes trade agreements, and it also includes the summit coming up next week. And they have just published a report on strengthening UK-EU relations, which I know Liam is going to talk about this evening. And I also understand he may talk about custard. So Liam, over to you.
That's the first ever introduction I've had referencing custard. Hello, thank you so much. And hi, everybody. It's really great to see everybody. Huge thanks, Helena, to you for just doing such a brilliant job, especially anchoring the work you're anchoring at Labour Movement for Europe. Makes a big difference. So I don't know what will happen on Monday, but what we wanted to do on the Select Committee is set out what should happen on Monday. As Helen said, this is a really, really big moment for the UK. This was something that we committed to in the manifesto. This is something around which we mobilised members and voters up and down the country. And let's be really clear about the prize that's at stake. We set out a big, bold target of becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7. Right now, we are not on course to hit that target. We're going to come in, so the forecasts say, at about the middle of the pack. One big move could actually move us to the top of the table, and that is an ambitious reset with the European Union. In fact, Best for Britain, which I know many of you will know and love, forecast that the kind of proposals that we're talking about in our report today could add anywhere between 1 and 1.5% of GDP as economic growth each and every year. That would just leapfrog us over Canada, over the United States, to the top of the G7 league table. It is the biggest single thing that we can do in this parliament to accelerate growth, to up wages, to transform the lives and livelihoods of the people that we came into politics to serve. So we thought on the Select Committee that there ought to be a green paper ahead of the summit, because when we go to Brussels or when we talk to businesses, lots of people have said to us, well, look, there should be a reset, but just what do you mean? What do you want out of that? So we thought that we would write the green paper that the government didn't produce. And what just took us aback is how easy it was to come up with 20 big ways in which we could reset that relationship. And then what really surprised us is the overwhelming level of support that we received for those measures when we published them as draft ideas. And the importance of this kind of really came home to me, as Helena said, in Northern Ireland, where I took the committee last week to go and look at the £130 million that we're spending on border control posts because we don't have an ambitious SPS agreement with our neighbours in Europe. And we were shepherded off to the cold storage rooms, and they're immaculate, and they're full of confiscated custard. And the reason for that is that the European Union decided on St. Patrick's Day morning that custard was not, in fact, a composite. Custard was, in fact, a dairy product, and therefore needed carton-specific labelling, not labelling merely on the boxes. And if you didn't have the right paperwork to take it through the red lane rather than the green lane, then it all needed to be confiscated. And there it was, sitting in the cold storage units at the border control post. Now, what a nonsense. How much money is being wasted through these kind of bureaucratic checks? Think how much money businesses are having to spend, literally tens of millions of pounds every year, managing this kind of bureaucratic paperwork. It's a complete nightmare. So if there is no other mental image that sticks with you tonight as a motif of the kind of terrible Brexit deal the Tories negotiated, just think of all those piles of custard in the cold storage units in Belfast. So what can we do about it? Well, we thought that there were three big areas where we could deepen cooperation. One is around defending our prosperity. The second is around energy cooperation. And the third is slashing red tape at the border. Defending our prosperity has got to be the cornerstone of what we do. There's going to be a big increase in defence spending across Europe. That should be a shared endeavour. Coming up with a common defence industrial strategy should be the first thing that we try and get right. We should couple that with an offer to help safeguard the critical national infrastructure, like the submarine cables that fall onto the continental shelf and connect Europe to the rest of the world. We should be deepening cooperation when it comes to tackling economic crime, and we should be working much more closely together with Europe in defending the rules-based trading system by joining up with Europe at the World Trade Organization, so that once again it becomes a functional place where we can settle disputes. Second big area then was in energy cooperation, and here we just took so much evidence that this could be one of the biggest single opportunities from a reset. If you think about the North Sea, lots of people said to us, look, the North Sea could be the world's biggest power plant. So much of Northern Europe depends on unlocking the potential for wind power in North Europe to hit their net zero targets. That should be an enormous win-win. But there's got to be a couple of things that we do to really unlock that prize. We've got to join up our electricity trading systems. That was kind of one of the unintended consequences of Brexit. If we did that, it would actually unlock a path to cheaper electricity and a lower cost path to net zero. We should be joining up our emission trading system. And crucially, we should actually be joining forces with Europe when it comes to creating a carbon border adjustment mechanism. If we don't do that, by the way, we're going to face a new tariff barrier when we export to Europe, because the carbon price in Europe is different to the carbon price in Europe. And then last, Helena, we have a whole load of ideas for how you cut red tape, both for goods exporters and for our services industries. An ambitious SPS agreement was the absolute cornerstone of this set of ideas, so that you don't have the kind of bureaucratic rigmarole that we currently have at the border. We then said that there was a whole load of ideas that we could be using, like trusted trader schemes, digitalising customs, organising better the work around checks on ro-ro ferries. We're just not driving any of that forward at the kind of pace that we need to be moving at right now. Big opportunity. We said that we should be rejoining the Pan-Euromed Convention, subject to a consultation with the automotive industry that is just a bit worried about getting the rules right for EV. And then there's sort of two other big topics that really kind of shone through for us. The first is on this vexed issue of dynamic alignment. We actually heard huge industry support for what they called maximising compatible regulation. So they actually want to keep as aligned to Europe as possible. And so what industry told us is, look, give us some 10-year regulatory roadmaps that give us some certainty and show how we can stick together with Europe, because actually certainty plus proximity and alignment is what really de-risks economic growth for us. And then, the last kind of big area where we found widespread support was in the idea of a youth mobility scheme. So age capped, quota-based, visa-based. We found really, really strong support for that as a way of helping ensure that our young people get a chance to live and work in Europe, and help making sure that young Europeans get a chance to come and live and work here in the UK. So when you put it all together, you get 20 different measures. When you measure the economic impact, you get something like a 1 to 1.5% boost to economic growth. Fundamental for this is some further simplification, like mutual recognition of conformity assessments, which is a big idea Best for Britain have recommended. But crucially, what we then found is that on pretty much every single one of these measures, we were getting north of 80% support from the industry groups that we went out to consult on. So there's not many things in politics which make a big impact to economic growth and to the wealth and livelihoods of the people we serve. Not many things like that are popular with business as well as with voters. But a big, bold, ambitious reset would appear to be in the sweet spot of good for growth and good for politics. So our message to the Prime Minister and President von der Leyen on Monday is go for it.
Thank you, Liam. That was really helpful and really informative. And I must say, I was watching Richard Harman's cat really reacting very positively to much of what you were saying, as well as everyone else. So thank you. And you're right that there is a huge demand from people to see a strong result from the summit next week. And we also had some polling out last week from the Good Growth Foundation, which showed that the British public do want to see a stronger relationship with the way the world is changing at the moment. So another reminder of the reasons to do this, because the British public want us to. As we're going on, if people have got questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to save them in your head for after Calvin has spoken, and you can put your hand up and ask it as well. We now move on to our next speaker, Calvin Bailey, who is the MP for Leighton and Wanstead. And before becoming a Member of Parliament, Calvin also has a long and distinguished career in the armed forces. So he's joining us this evening, particularly to talk about the element of the summit next week that's going to focus on defence and security cooperation and why that's important and what we might see coming out of the summit next week. Over to you, Calvin.
Thanks very much, Helena, and thank you for hosting this evening's discussion. Thanks for Liam for setting such a high standard. I hope not to disappoint. So just to clarify, I 25 years in the Royal Air Force, but also the Ministry of Defence. I was also one of the first Franco-British Council Young Leaders, and therefore was quite involved in some of the Lancaster House agreements discussions between 2017 and when I left the service in 2024, just prior to the election. So the summit then is, for us, is not just an opportunity for a diplomatic reset, which is what I think Liam was trying to get after, but it's also quite a critical opportunity for us to reset the strategic foundations of UK and EU relations, because we are living in an increasingly unstable geopolitical environment. My focus this evening has, I was told it could be broader than security, but is defence and security, which is increasingly inseparable from our broader economic and industrial resilience, as Liam set out. So I've got sort of 5 points that I'll talk around, and I'll try and get through them as quickly as I can. The first really is the changing threat environment. Why is this important? What requires us to reconsider our relationship between the, requires us to consider closer UK EU security cooperation. And that is because things have profoundly changed since 2022. And I would say actually the journey has that started probably, we could go all the way back to 2007 in discussion, but since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we have seen an intensification of hybrid campaigns across Europe, including cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and covert support and for extremist actors. And in particular, I wouldn't have perhaps believed this myself some time ago, but we've seen this very up close and personal. So you can Google an article I was associated with a few months ago about the disturbing presence of Russian-linked hate activity in my own constituency, because warfare now doesn't respect borders, and our communities are not immune to those transnational threats. The same, we saw similar such threats in France, and we may have seen other malign activity that doesn't look like traditional warfare. And that is why, or fundamentally why, we need to consider ourselves not immune, not single countries, but as a bloc and a group of countries that share values and ideals. Russia has increased its defence budget now to about 6% of GDP. Liam can explain why that is significantly greater in relative terms. But the real challenge to us lies in its capacity to sustain industrialised warfare over time. It's not just what a country spends on its defence, it's also what it can mobilise economically and technologically, and then probably most importantly, socially. And that defines a country, a capacity to wage war, and that requires a wider lens than NATO. And certainly as we reflect on VE Day, national endeavour and a broader societal approach is essential to our ability to resist acts of aggression. At the moment, though, the US remains the cornerstone of NATO, but with its increasing focus on the Indo-Pacific region and let's call it its unpredictable domestic political climate, the case for autonomous European capabilities, including UK-EU cooperations, grows ever stronger. The second big point is we missed a lot of opportunities post-Brexit or in the post-Brexit settlement, and I was really hoping not to use that term, but like the reality is there. In the original Brexit arrangements, there was no formal provision for the UK-EU defence cooperation, and that permission had significant consequences. We lack any kind of structure for joint operational planning, for strategic alignment. And as Liam pointed to, UK defence firms, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, are locked out of EU industrial and R&D programs, including the European Defence Fund and the very new £150 billion SAFE initiative. Cyber cooperation remains ad hoc. Intelligence sharing remains largely bilateral, and the marginalisation from an evolving European security architecture has constrained our strategic options, diluted our industrial opportunities, and weakened our ability to shape a European response to systematic threats, and that itself is very important. Next, I would ask is the why. Why a security and defence partnership is essential at this moment. Well, a forthcoming partnership isn't just a correction, but actually it's intellectually and practically robust. It's not just about military hardware or alliance structures. It's about about the political economy of security, the ability to scale and sustain defence capacity under pressure, an industrial base, workforce skills, supply chains, resilience, and long-term investments are all instruments of deterrence in themselves. Part of the threat of Russia is its ability to put it not only its soldiers through the meat grinder, but to be able to sustain the industrial capacity that keeps them there. In that light, this agreement in particular, or any agreement, must provide legal and institutional pathways for UK participation in EU defence funding and procurement, particularly SAFE and the ReArm initiative. We should seek to address market access and programme eligibility for UK defence SMEs, and we should try and foster collaboration on critical technologies like AI, where the UK and France in particular have a very sort of yin and yang symbiotic relationship. Cybersecurity and space systems are both critical because we are largely reliant on the US and shouldn't allow ourselves to be. And we must also establish a mechanism for strategic dialogue that enables joint threat assessment, scenario planning, and forward coordination. If we don't recognise some of what is referred to as hybrid warfare or grey zone operations, then we won't have a shared understanding of what the necessary responses are, and therefore that allows space for our enemies to work between us. Fourth, we must also consider the state of the UK defence industry and innovation. We continue to maintain an industrial and technological advantages in several domains, but quite a lot of these are at risk at the moment. SMEs have significant barriers to procurement, delays in payment and limited access to follow-on contracts. And engagement with our own MOD is incredibly cumbersome. And venture capital can't reliably substitute structured public investment. I held a round table today with the defence sector, trying to highlight some of the challenges, and I joined Liam on his committee to consider how our interaction with some of our large defence primes and SMEs could or are being impacted from our ability to flow capital at a reasonable rate. A partnership with the EU would allow specialisation, it would allow economies of scale, and it would allow risk sharing, which are all the things that are critical for sustaining defence, R&D in particular, and most notably in emerging technologies. Because without access to these collaborative programs, we risk strategic duplication, inefficient spending, and loss of industrial capacity over time. And you may have heard when I was speaking about this earlier in the week at the Defence Select Committee, I spoke of us at being a risk of being an IP island, where companies, foreign companies can come in, American firms in essence can come and cherry pick these things because we won't have and don't have the ability to scale them up adequately. So our party's position, as you put out, Helen, I'll be finished shortly. I think it's really important that we must seek the establishment of those procurement frameworks. We must advocate for UK participation in EU defence investment and financing mechanisms, and I'll talk about defence security and resilience bank because I think that will be fundamental to doing this, and we must do that alongside our partners. We must pursue and associate ourselves with EU defence programmes, even where full membership is not viable because there are some limits. But fundamentally, we can't be nostalgic towards our pre-Brexit arrangement. We must be forward-looking. We must recognise the change in scenario, the change in situation in which we are in, and therefore we must have forward-looking policies that are designed to respond to the new strategic landscape and that take us forward together.
Great, thank you, Calvin. Really helpful, and again, I enjoyed watching this time and Kat react to that. We've got a little gathering of LME cats this evening as well as members, so great to have everyone involved, and maybe the cats are particularly keen to hear about the pet passports, which I know has come up in the chat. We're now going to move to some questions, and I know we've had a few questions in the chat already, but if you also would like to ask a question yourself, feel free to put your hand up, whether you've put one in the chat or not already. But the first question we've got in the chat is from John, and John is asking about what might happen to pet passports if we agree SPS and ECJ oversight. So we will note that question and take a couple of questions and then come back to the panelists. So thank you, John, for that question. Couple of other comments in the chat about freedom of movement and what that could look like going forward, youth mobility, also somebody mentioning the Erasmus scheme and what the future of that might be, and other comments about food security as well. George Peretz has put a question in the chat, I believe, but perhaps, George, if you want to put your hand up, because it's quite a long question, so it might be easier to ask that with your hand up. I can see Carol's got her hand up as well, so Carol, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the speakers so much, and it's nice to see Calvin covering some of my old constituency, and I wish him very well in those endeavours. And I agree with everything our speakers have said, but just wanted to go beyond that very briefly and say, government's saying that growth is key, that the creative industries are key to that. We've now had an announcement of a putative 100% tariff on films made outside the US, exposes our model of dependency on US inward film investment. And so, having helped to write the Creative Europe programme back in the 90s, I'd like to suggest that we need to pivot back towards the European Union from a cultural and film point of view. And Chris Bryant knows, he gets very bored when I keep mentioning this every time I see him. We need to rejoin Creative Europe, because within it, and this is what the CMS Select Committee has also said, you have the media programme, which is a massive asset. You know, supported films like King's Speech, Yellow Submarine, Slumdog Millionaire. Co-productions, everybody would like to co-produce with us, but they don't see a way at the moment. But it also, importantly, Helena, it sends a key political message of desire for real cooperation that goes beyond very functional cooperation, which we heard from our speakers today. It's sending a wider, deeper message involving cultural exchange. And I believe if we were to do that, cost us between 50 and 100 million to do it. There's very many third countries who are members. It could do something like unlock the touring for musicians conundrum as well. So I'd really like us to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I can now see George has got his hand up. So George, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Yeah, fraternal greetings from the Society of Labour Lawyers, of which I'm chair. Yeah, I want to make two very brief points. One, in understanding the dynamic here, it's, I think, as Liam correctly referred to, very important to remember the set of problems associated with Northern Ireland and the Windsor Framework. And Liam correctly identified one aspect of that, which is that the absence of any SPS agreement creates all sorts of problems in trade across the Irish Sea in food and agricultural products. But there's a whole set of other problems which would be made much easier if we are prepared to align our relationship with the EU in certain regulatory areas. I do a lot of work in medicinal products, for example, and one of the enormous problems that the UK government has in regulating medicines, and one of the reasons why our medicines rules remain pretty much what they were when we were in the EU, is that if you have different medicines rules in Northern Ireland, as we have to have because we've committed to follow EU rules there, and in Great Britain, then you create all sorts of problems. So there is everything to be said for dynamically aligning our medicines rules with those of the EU from a Northern Ireland perspective. The second point I wanted to make in relation to services, which tend to be the forgotten element of any trade agreement, is that a critical problem for services exports from the UK, and this is true of a number of areas ranging from professional services to tourism to all sorts of other things, is mobility. Services are intrinsically linked to mobility. Many aspects of providing services involve business mobility, the ability to go and talk to your client about their problems, to spend some time with your client dealing with their problems. So I think in trade terms, in sort of technical trade jargon, that's referred to as mode for provision of services, but it's absolutely critical for a whole variety of services. And that is intrinsically linked to the ability of people to travel reasonably freely across the Channel, across the Irish Sea, to supply services, to deal with clients without having to apply for visas, without having to respect fairly arbitrary restrictions on length of stay. And if you're going to seriously improve and remove barriers to services, then you are going to have to grapple with mobility issues. Classic example of that, and of course it's a commitment of the Labour Manifesto, is musicians, because the ability of our musicians to go and play and do gigs in Germany and France and so on is absolutely critically linked to mobility issues, their ability to go and do what they need, go and play, do what they want to do without having bureaucratic visa requirements, restrictions on the equipment they can bring with them, and so on. And that will also need to be dealt with. And there is obviously a tension between dealing with those problems and the message Labour is in other respects wanting to send out about immigration. And I think that has to be faced.
Thank you, George. Very helpful insight. So I'm going to come back to the panelists now. And we have a question from George about regulatory alignment and how we balance those tensions. A question on pet passports and whether that might feature at all next week. And then Carol's question around the importance of culture and the creative sector. And I know certainly as an MP representing a very densely concentrated place with many different creative industries, including many musicians and artists, that's something we feel very strongly about too. So Liam, over to you on those points.
Brilliant, thank you. On alignment, just again to underline, the amount of support that we heard from the business community about the need to maximise alignment was extraordinary. I mean, we heard only one sector express the ambition for a bit more latitude from EU frameworks, and that were the folks in the technology and AI sectors. And even there, they said, look, the way that Peter Kyle has actually gone about coordinating with the European Commission and ensuring that we've got some agreement on the basic principles of our approach, and it was really, really welcome. Now, we kind of put this into a draft green paper, which we then put out to consultation about 3 weeks ago. But you're talking about, north of 80% of support from the business stakeholders that we heard back from said maximising compatible regulation is a good thing to do. Now, George is right to say in the services industry, it does need to be coupled with a couple of things. So we definitely need to improve business mobility arrangements. At the moment, we've obviously got this provision for 90-day visa-free travel, but there are all kinds of weird carve-outs that just make it really complicated. So you can't sell actuarial services in Italy, for example. You can't deliver construction services in Cyprus. The whole thing is kind of riddled with a whole load of kind of exceptions that just make life really difficult for people trying to do business. There were a couple of other areas just to flag, and I would say the two areas where we found the biggest levels of support were on deepening research collaboration and on mutual recognition of qualifications. So at the moment, the mutual recognition for qualifications agreement or the kind of qualifications we're trying to get mutual recognition for has gone nowhere. So it needs a big, bold reset pretty quickly. And again, it shows up in all kinds of weird ways. So pilots, for example, was something that Virgin flagged with us. You can't get kind of mutual recognition of pilot licenses. So again, it's a really significant problem. And then on research, I mean, hooray, we've rejoined Horizon. We've done really well out of that. I mean, it's been 575 million euros of extra research funding that has come to British universities participating in that. So joining the next round of Horizon at FP10 was something that was sort of really, really popular. On pet passports, I think pet passports would actually be covered if you got the SBS agreement right. So we did have a very extensive conversation about pet passports with the EFRA veterinary officers at the Belfast ports. And again, this was something where they just thought lots of red tape at the moment, stop people moving around in the way that they wanted. They seemed reasonably confident that you could include something around pet passports in the SBS agreement, although I will defer to veterinary scientists on the call when it comes to the precise details. And then this point about, Carol's point about film, I think is really important. So, this is a £21 billion industry for the UK. That's a pretty big number. It brings in about 5 billion of investment. And it's not just significant economically, it's critical to Britain's soft power globally. And so, again, what we need to see in the industrial strategy, which is going to follow on from the reset quite quickly, some pretty significant investments in the creative industries. And I think once we then have a sense of what we're going to be investing in this space, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier to actually broker some of the joint agreements that we need with the European Union. So I just think, although President Trump's team will often say America first doesn't mean America alone, it does kind of feel at times like it's an America alone strategy. But the broader point is deepening our relationship with our closest neighbours across culture, across creative industries, across so many different sectors of the business community. It's good for growth and it's good for our country. It's good for our safety, it's good for our security, and it's good for the prospects of the next generation.
Thank you very much, Liam. I'm conscious we've got more hands up. Calvin, was there anything you wanted to add to what Liam said, or should we take some more questions?
Just very briefly, just to
Sure.
add, I will provide a defence spin on pretty much everything. And it's not really a defence spin, because I think we kind of need to move away from defence. The whole previous 15 to 20 years, we've assumed that defence is something that we do by choice overseas, and we forgot that the reason why we came about the structures that we had and cherished, the most cherished of which was the EU, was because us being thrust together and doing things together was fundamentally centered around our shared views and values, of which the most cherished is culture. And it is really important that we support and establish and re-establish some of these arrangements, like Creative Europe, so that we have shared, we remember and remind ourselves of our shared values and ideals, because they are what hold us together. That's what brought about the EU and the liberal system that's there. And it's really important that those things are at the core of any agreement, and almost everything comes from around that.
Great, thank you. Conscious we've got more hands going up, and we are going to draw this to a close in just under 10 minutes, because I'm conscious that my colleagues are still in their offices and need to get home and have some supper before a busy day tomorrow in Parliament, where we're voting on assisted dying. So I'm going to come to those with their hands up. I'm just going to pick 3 of you, and if you could keep it brief, so keep your question to 20-30 seconds. I'm going to start with, of course, our former Labour MEP, Richard Corbett.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the speakers. I agree with just about everything that's been said. One little quibble is that the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration appended to it, did actually provide for a future security agreement. Boris Johnson then refused to negotiate that, which is why we ended up just with a trade and cooperation agreement. But that was approved by both parliaments. But my question is the following. A lot of what is being proposed amounts to, in practice, rejoining bits of the single market. Because what is the single market? It's aligning rules so that goods and services can flow freely without border checks, new certification requirements, labelling, and so on. So why do we keep this red line of not rejoining the single market when that is precisely what we are proposing to do in practice in large parts?
Thank you, Richard. I'm also going to call on Luzungu.
Hi. This is an incredible event. It's the first time I've actually joined. And as a first university student, I've really been interested in the youth mobility aspect of it. As you know, many people in my course, we only have very limited opportunities to do political aspect work with the EU, and it's not really like affordable for us young people. So I was wondering, what are the aspects of the youth mobility scheme, and what could we see with the UK EU relations event?
Great question. And then last question goes to Philip Watson.
Hi everybody. Hi Richard, especially to Richard. He was a superb member of the European Parliament. I believe he was the Vice President at one stage. But my specific question is this. All the problems that Brexit has caused for Britain is it possible to negotiate a new treaty with the European Parliament and the European Union and Great Britain? Is it possible to have a treaty that cuts out all the nonsense that we're all facing on a daily basis, all the British citizens living on the continent, the problems with the students, the problems with Erasmus, it can go on forever. You know, the Galileo project, the satellite system, and especially the problems with the regional grants and the problems with Ireland, the south and the north. Is it possible to have a new treaty that encompasses the whole lot?
Thank you, Philip. There's a bit of interference on your line, but I think we got that question loud and clear. Back to our panelists. Calvin, I'll start with you, and then I'll come to Liam to close.
Okay, well, I will be swift, I think, in tackling these and then let Liam get into the detail. The thing I would say is that regardless of, so the first comment is entirely right, and what we had was the gold standard, and we must never lose sight of the fact that that provided all the alignment and the relationships, the agreed licensing, and all of the things that everyone on this call would wish for. However, we've got to have a bit of realpolitik in that the nation voted to leave, and regardless of how ambitious we want to be, we have to find our way back to somewhere closer to the place that we are in a managed way. And I'm being quite blunt about this, we need to take the nation along with us. Because if we get this wrong, we'll all be standing on the sidelines shouting at a whole load of reformers sat in our seats. And that is pivotal. And what the party is attempting to do at the moment is to do exactly what Liam said, is to pick the parts of the agreement that are really impactful for us, that will help move ourselves back towards a closer position, and that will help build and establish the argument and the closer alignment to perhaps try at some point in the future to do what our last questioner asked for, which is to go back and have a complete refresh of this. But right now, we are where we are, to use a horrible American term, and that we require skill and intellect that Liam and his team have put to this problem, and then we need our government to go and take that and try and be as ambitious as we can, and then we must all lead and remake the arguments so that we take everyone along with us. And don't think that I have limited ambition. I don't. I just realise that like it is imperative that we make sure that we do this in a way that that addresses the fundamental failures and flaws of the arrangement that we have, takes us closer, and starts us perhaps on a longer journey. Liam.
Thank you. So just a couple of things to close up then. I mean, I think strategically, we've got to recognise that, as Calvin said much more eloquently than I could, we are now moving into a very different era. And, one of the characteristics of that era is that America is kind of, to a degree, withdrawing from that multilateral system that we created together as allies between 1944 and the creation of the OECD in 1961. And, that could actually be an opportunity for the UK and Europe working together, as long as this coalition of the willing that believes not just in the rules-based order, but the rights-based order, the rights that are enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, which you can date back through the UN Charter on Human Rights, through to the Bill of Rights in this country, ultimately back to Magna Carta. That great charter, as Churchill called it, is the foundation of a rights-based order that could be much more influential in the world that is emerging. And so, we have got to not leap into that, but we have definitely got to move in that direction. And so we've got to accept, I think, that we laid out a manifesto offer that we were elected on that set out a cage of red lines. But, we are not going to get re-elected as a party by chasing down every single reform voter and trying to outright Nigel Farage. What Labour has got to do is bring together, fuse together that kind of progressive alliance of good people in this country, in the centre ground very often, but definitely through out to the centre left and left. And actually our European vision could be one of the most important mobilising factors in bringing that coalition together and winning the next general election. Because there is an anti-reform coalition in this country, there is an anti-Farage coalition in this country, and we've got to be the champion of those people. And so I hope that we can go into the next election with a much more ambitious story to tell about the red lines that we want to cast into history. But I think we've just got to cross the river stone by stone. And what really surprised us when we were putting that kind of report together that we published today is how easy it was to put together lots of different ways in which we can bring ourselves close together and actually deliver not just a win for Britain, but a win for Europe too. Ultimately, Europe needs to grow faster. Europe has a problem with populism. Europe can only conquer that problem with populism by delivering rising living standards for a much, much bigger number of people. They've got to pursue some of the changes that Mario Draghi has proposed in his report, along with the Letter report. But the ideas that we've set out as a select committee could add to those ideas by bringing the UK and Europe much more close together. So I think, the direction that Richard sets out personally for me is the right one. I think it's right for the country. I think it's right for Labour politically. And the question is that, what is the roadmap for the journey there? And so I think, in a way, that kind of answers the question about what we add to the agreement that we've got at the moment, the TCA. Ultimately, the European Commission would say, look, the TCA is the maximum that is possible given the red lines that the UK has set. I think actually that you can overlay onto that new ambition for new times. If you've got America leaving the multilateral system that they created, if you've got what you might call a Mexit, that should force us to rethink Brexit, not just in London, but in Brussels too. And so deepening the different dimensions of our alliance, I think, is important. And I just want to finish with Luzinga's brilliant question, really, because, we're not going to necessarily deliver everything that we want in the next few years. And it's important that the next generation are equipped and geared up with the networks, thinking, relationships, ideals, that they're going to need in order to carry this project forward into the deep 21st century. And so making sure that we are ambitious about creating opportunities, not just for those who are lucky enough to go to university, but for young people on apprenticeships, people who are leaving school early. There is no reason why a youth mobility scheme should just be for those lucky enough to get into university. We should be much more democratic about our ambitions for that. We should be thinking about apprenticeships and the way that apprentices get the chance to move, live and travel and work in Europe. And we should be thinking about many of our young people too. So, ultimately, this has got to be a project of ensuring that our next generation has a deep and shared history of the European past, the best of European ideals, and crucially, we must make sure that they're inspired by a shared vision for a European future.
Great. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening and for being members of the Labour Movement for Europe at this very important time for our country and for our movement. I'm sure the conversation will continue in future LME events and also at the debate that we have in Parliament next Thursday on the outcomes of the summit. And I'm sure we will all see Liam and possibly Calvin too on the airwaves next week talking about the results of the summit. So we're very grateful to have had this preview, this exclusive preview this evening. So thanks very much, everyone, and see you all again soon.